Today's lecture is going to be on the organization of the nervous system. The first part that we'll be looking at is going to be the structural organization. The first part is the central nervous system. This consists of the spinal cord and the brain. They are both responsible for integrating, processing, and coordinating sensory data and implementing motor commands. The other division that we have is the peripheral nervous system. That includes the 12 cranial nerves, 31 spinal nerves, and a collection of ganglia, which are simply neuron cell bodies. So when we're looking at the functional organization of the nervous system, the first part that we should always begin the lecture is on the sensory nervous system. When we're looking at the sensory nervous system, we're receiving sensory information from receptors and transferring this information to the central nervous system. And it's also referred to as input. So the sensory nervous system will help detect stimuli and transmits all information from receptors to the central nervous system. The two areas or organizational areas that we look at is the first one is the somatic. The somatic sensory can be anything from touch, pain, pressure, vibration, temperature, proprioception, vision, hearing, balance, and smell. What we're looking at is the sensory input is consciously perceived from receptors, such as organelles as the eyes, ears, and skin. And the other division that we have is the visceral sensory. And the visceral sensory is going to transmit nerve impulses from blood vessels and viscera to the central nervous system. These are touch and stretch receptors, such as muscles and organ walls. So we're constantly perceiving receptors of blood vessels and internal organs, and that information is going to be inputted into the central nervous system. The second area that we'll look at is going to be the output, or what is known as the motor nervous system. The motor nervous system, its main job is to transmit motor impulses from the central nervous system to muscles or glands. When we're looking at this, their job is to eventually going to deliver some type of a motor command to an effector. And that effector can come in two areas. The first one is a somatic motor, and this is the motor output that is consciously or voluntarily controlled, and that's probably the most important aspect. Usually their effector is going to be a skeletal muscle, but again, it's under conscious control. The other delivery of a motor command can go into an autonomic motor, and the autonomic motor innervates any of the internal organs and regulates smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle such as the heart, and glands without control. These are considered to be involuntary. So the most important aspect is going to be that autonomic motor commands are going to be considered to be involuntary. So the biggest breakdown we'll have is on the neuron structure. One of the key aspects of any neurons is that it is going to be under a high metabolic rate, meaning that it's going to consume large amounts of oxygen and glucose. It has an extreme longevity, so usually the neurons that you develop in childhood will be the ones that you have to adulthood. And they are non-meiotic, which means that they do not divide. The first thing we'll look at on the neuron structure is going to be the most important aspect, which is going to be the cell body. The cell body is also referred to as the soma or somata. This serves as the neuron's control center and is responsible for receiving information from the dendrites, integrating or processing, and then sending that information down in the form of an action potential through the axon. Inside of the cell body, the most important organelle that we should look at is going to be the nucleus. It's enclosed in a plasma membrane, so this outer surface is the plasma membrane, and it contains cytoplasm surrounding the nucleus. This cytoplasm within the cell body is called a perikaryon. It also has a prominent nucleolus, and the nucleolus is reflecting the high metabolic activity of the neurons, which requires the production of many proteins for structural support. It also has numerous mitochondria that are present to produce large amounts of ATP due to the high metabolic rate. And it also has, it's not showing in here, but these small organelles inside of the plasma membrane, they have both the free and bound ribosomes, and together these are called chromatophilic substances. The chromatophilic substances, along with the dendrites and the cell body, account for what we call the gray matter. And then, as mentioned earlier, the most important aspect is that it does not have the ability to divide. So it lacks centrioles, or the organelle that allows this structure to divide. So neuron cell bodies, or neurons in general, cannot divide. When we're looking at any information coming in to the cell body, it's always going to be coming through the direction through the dendrites. As the information is coming in, this highly branched usually contains about 80 to 90% of the neuron's total surface. And these neurons receive information from other neurons at these dendritic spines. So this area would be the connection to another dendritic spine, which then would lead to a dendrite to a cell body. So as the information is coming in, the cell body will then process the information and determine whether or not the action potential should continue. And that is going to then cross this structure called an axon hillock. It's basically an attachment of the initial segment of the axon. It does not have any chromatophilic substances, so it does not have any free or bound ribosomes. We also consider this to be, once the cell body decides that the action potential should propagate, we consider this, the axon hillock, to be the trigger. So once it passes the initial segment, then the action potential will continue to propagate or move to its effector. So the axon hillock is just the initial segment. And then we have this long cytoplasmic process capable of propagation of the action potential that eventually is going to make contact with neurons, muscle cells, or even glands. So within these axons, we also have these side branches called axon collaterals. And these axon collaterals that allow a single neuron to help communicate with other cells. Most axons, so the majority of axons and their collateral branches, are all going to have these terminal extensions called terminal arborizations. And these arborizations are at the end of the extensions are going to be where we see the synaptic knobs, or also referred to as the axon terminals. The last part worth mentioning is going to be this myelin sheath. This myelin sheath helps support, protect, and insulate an axon. The gaps that we see are called neurofibril nodes. So this is an area of myelination. This is an area of myelination. And in between here we see these neurofibril nodes. They're also called nodes of Ranvier. At these nodes, a change in voltage occurs across the plasma membrane, and the result is going to be the movement of the propagation that continues uh, of the nerve impulse along the axon. So this area is very important for changes in voltage. And finally, the last structure on this slide is going to be the neurolemmacyte. The neurolemmacyte is also called the Schwann cell. You can see in the picture that they're very elongated. Here's one, they're purple stained. They're very elongated, flattened cells that wrap around the axon within the peripheral nervous system. They form this concentric ring, and basically they are going to form the myelin sheath. They're the structure that begins the process. After the myelin has been wrapping, eventually the neurolemmacyte gets shoved to the outer surface of the myelin sheath. But this neurolemmacyte is what initiates the initial wrapping of myelin around the axon. When we're looking at neuron classifications, with these neuron classifications, we see it occurring in 3 different classifications. The first one is going to be the unipolar classification, or unipolar neuron. Most sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system are unipolar neurons. They're often myelinated, which allows for the propagation of the action potential to come into the central nervous system at a very fast rate. It has 2 areas. So this first area here, called the peripheral process, this is simply going to be from a dendrite to the cell body. And then the other process that a unipolar neuron has is called a central process. And this central process is going to be from the cell body to the central nervous system. So you can consider the unipolar the delivery of the majority of sensory information eventually into the central nervous system. So the effector in this one is going to be the central nervous system. The next one is the bipolar neurons. These are very limited, so they're limited to specifically special senses. We see these in the olfactory epithelium of the nose, and also we see this in the retina of the eye. So again, special sense organs, dendrites are connected to another dendrite. The cell body is going to process that information and then eventually deliver it to the central nervous system. And then finally, the most common type is going to be the multipolar neurons. Again, most common type of neuron. They have many dendrites. So in this picture, we see the connection of these dendrites will be connected to the dendrites of numerous other neurons. And they also have, very important, they only have one single axon. An example includes the motor neurons that innervate muscles and glands. So this picture is going to be a general diagram of information coming from the peripheral nervous system. So over here, the skin receptor would be the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. And then it is going to be processed inside of the spinal cord or the central nervous system, and then a motor command will be delivered back to the peripheral nervous system. So when we're looking at the sensory neurons, especially the ones in the skin receptors, any type of touch that occurs onto the skin, we call this an afferent pathway or an input transmission. And it is going to be going always into, all sensory information is going to be coming into the posterior root ganglion. And particularly taking note that all sensory information is going to come through, processed by the cell body of the sensory neuron in the posterior aspect of this ganglion. It's then going to make its way into the particular area. For instance, this would be a somatic sensory, so it would be targeting a specific area of the gray matter of the central nervous system. And then it's going to be, the dendrite is going to connect to the dendrite of this structure called an interneuron. And these neurons are very important. Basically, 99% of the neurons in the human body are interneurons. So this one is the most important neuron that we have. And their job is to interconnect the peripheral nervous system with the central nervous system. So the sensory information is coming in. The dendrites are connecting to the dendrites of the interneuron. And we see these interneurons, they're located in the brain, and of course in this picture in the spinal cord, and they have a structure, or they're considered to be a multipolar structure. They retrieve, they process, they store information, and basically they are going to decide how the body is going to respond to the stimuli. So they're basically facilitating communication in this example from the sensory information coming from the skin. They're going to process that information, and then they are going to decide what response or motor command should be sent through for especially the particular reaction. They're very coordinated, so these interneurons can learn, they have a memory, or they plan, and they allow for specific pathways. So here we have an interneuron of the sensory. It's going to connect to the motor neuron, and then it is going to then deliver along the efferent pathway, or what we consider to be the output transmission, to the effector along the axon, to the effector of the skeletal muscle. So for instance, if there was a scratch on the neck, that information gets processed. The interneuron decides what area should be stimulated. The motor neuron then is going to stimulate the bicep brachii, and then you would flex the elbow to scratch the side of the neck. And that concludes the first part of the lecture.